Thank
So
you.
we continue right now with the first session, actually, our presentations, where Professor Tyagi was waiting right now for us. She's going to be speaking about competition policy, but going from competition on the merits to sustainable competition on the merits, and present the case, her research basically on the matter and how we can deal with the current legal framework to tackle sustainability issues. So Professor Tyagi, the floor is all yours.
Can you hear me?
We have an echo, so we have an issue.
Yeah. Can you hear me fine now?
Yeah, now it's fine without any echo, but we can't see your presentation. Well, yes, we can. Okay, fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine right now.
Good. Thanks a lot, Lena, for the invitation. I'm a bit tight on time because I have teaching all day today, but I'll try to compress my presentation and take some key takeaway points from there. So basically, in this research, what I'm looking at is competition policy with a touch of green. What is the meaning of taking competition policy, making it green? In other words, I look at it from the dimension of competition on the merits. I give it a definition which I say a movement from competition on the merits to sustainable competition on the merits. And this, in fact, is the basis that I present in my approach, that I look at the issue from the dimension of sustainable competition on the merits. Now, as we all know, what is meant by competition on the merits is basically a conduct by an enterprise which may or may not be dominant, because it could also be used in the context of, at least in this research, I use it both in the context of dominant enterprises as well as an agreement between two or more enterprises which may or may not be collectively dominant, even if such a conduct were to negatively impact the contestability of the market. Now, I picked this starting definition from also where the origins of the term really are, from Hans Carl Lippert, who defined competition on the merits as a concept of positive competition. And contrary to this, I look at Nick Leistun's Wettbewerb, which is competition of the merits. And taking this as a basic definition, what I'm essentially looking at is looking at competition law and unfair competition law as two dimensions to be able to define my approach in this book as regards how to assess green competition. Now, when I look at this and pursue this approach to look at sustainability issues in competition policy, then obviously three questions become most relevant. The first is, what is sustainable? Second is, should all or some things count towards sustainability? And finally, what role, if any, for economics? Now, to be able to answer these questions, I first look at an interdisciplinary perspective on the issue. Because what is important to understand is that on the face of it, oftentimes what we see that there might be an inherent conflict between the interests of an individual and those of the firm and of those of the society at large. Now, at a firm level, the incentives which may be encountered by a firm, they might be different, which in the short run at least, they seem to be in conflict with the larger goals of the society. Now, as an example, whereas it is always of benefit for all of us to be able to live in a healthy, a pollution-free society and to have green products, these goals might oftentimes conflict with the goals of short-term corporatism. That is, the vision of sustainability might oftentimes be in contrast with the short-term goals of a firm. Now, therefore, what I find from this interdisciplinary approach is that one of the key dilemmas that firms oftentimes face is what are these uphill costs in going sustainable? Now, it is true that if I look at the regulatory framework, such as the rules on environmental compliance and tax incentives, which may be a very good outer silhouette of such a policy design, uh, it is seen that the inner fabric of such an approach can possibly be defined by competition policy. So a greening approach to competition policy may be held, for instance, in cases where short-term derogations may be very desirable to achieve a certain objective. Now, this could, for instance, be the case when a green measure may mean more substantial initial sunk cost in research and development, which can in turn be potentially covered over the long run once the market for such sustainable products achieves economies of scale. Now, if we look at quantitative evidence, it also indicates that better environmental performance in the long run also leads to reduction in the cost of capital. So in other words, what I mean is, if we can sustain this cost of going sustainable, it can in the long term be converted into static efficiency once we reach economies of scale and scope. Now, obviously, this also has spillover effects on other areas of corporate, such as the stock market valuations, should the firms be listed on the stock exchange. Then the question which comes is, from a competition policy perspective, does it mean more enforcement? Does it mean less enforcement, right? Now, if I look at Porter, for a competitive advantage to be long-lasting, as he says, it must be grounded either in cost competitiveness or in innovation, with one based in innovation is clearly more sustainable. Now, sustainability of the business also means that a competition driven by innovation is also in the long-term interest of the firm. Now, the question is, does this mean that acting pro-competitive, pro-environment may in fact be of advantage to the firm in the long run? If so, then the question is not so much of one of designing the current competition policy framework as it is of realigning the current approach. Now, in short, what I mean is this then calls for a reframing of the debate, and wherever it is required, readjusting the perspective of what we call this environmental competitiveness divide. In the paper and in the book, I also take some examples of, for example, some of the directives which were actually meant to, for example, label dangerous substances, and it was actually meant to bring down barriers to trade, but it also incidentally have had a good impact on environment. So in terms of environmental improvement. So the idea is that environment and economics may at times be more aligned and pro-competitive than it may seem at first sight. And then I go on to take some hypothetical scenarios if required. I've given the reference to the article, and I'll be happy to take up in the Q&A. How should such agreements be assessed by a competition authority? Very briefly put, to summarize the finding, the idea is that while conditions which look at, for example, efficiency, they can be loosely dealt with. However, the issue of the impact of such an agreement on competition needs to be dealt with very severely, which is the two last conditions of Article 101. And also very briefly referring to merger control, I discuss the three key cases, which are Kensina, Syngenta, Dow DuPont, and Bayer Monsanto. And then the question that comes is whether there should be more enforcement or there should be less enforcement. Now, the key point that I want to raise here, and I want to refer to the relevant article there, these mergers, my key finding is, are a trend towards consolidation in not only the established market, but also they can be classified a transaction that consolidates data and create big data-driven agricultural conglomerates. So these mergers, in other words, what they do is essentially that these 6 to 4 mergers, they aid data capture as dominance in one market can effectively be leveraged to capture value from the farmers across the value chain. In other words, vertical integration in digital agriculture and data-driven markets facilitates internalization of value capture. Then Also, I briefly look at how to look at competition law as part of a connected and coherent whole. Therein, I look at how the treaty articles, particularly the TFEU and the provisions in Article 3.3 of the TU, which respectively call for environmental integration and sustainable development of Europe, can serve as a good reference point. And finally, one of the key takeaways that I take from the paper is the approach to look at competition policy as part of a big picture is imperative to ensure that while green thinking, it makes its way through competition policy, it in no way leads to greenwashing. Therefore, it is important to ensure that the holy grail of sustainable development is not used as a smokescreen by businesses. However, it also needs to be taken into consideration that green competition, sustainable competition could also be a source of sustainable competitive advantage of firms. Therefore, the spirit of this greening competition policy, if it's well implemented, it can take us from competition on the merits to sustainable competition on the merits. With this, I summarize, and if there are any Q&As.
Thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time. I know you're super busy. This was very pleasurable, and it goes very much in line with what Professor Holmes was explaining before, that in order to be timely, we need to kind of redesign what we have and use and reinterpret instead of invent something super new. So I would give the floor right now to our audience, since we have 5 short minutes that we can take away from Professor. If anybody has a comment or a question or something to add before I start adding. Any comments, questions, remarks, notes? You're all still sleepy, I guess. If you have a comment, please raise your hand so that I don't speak in front of you, or if you have a question, put it in the chat. Otherwise, I will just address a question to the professor right now and then let you be. So in the course of your research, if you would have to pinpoint one best practice, one best way to go right now with the competition to kind of align it with the most regenerative, sustainable practices, and in that I mean specifically circular practices, what would be the first step that you would take as a professional in the field, as a professor in the field, that you would say, okay, this is quite easy to implement or quite easy to interpret in this way, and it can be useful for specifically, let's say, circular agreements? Do you have something in your mind that would be kind of the best way? A recommendation of kind of based on your research?
Yeah, indeed. I think looking at it from that perspective, even though I find 2 areas very interesting, obviously merger control and looking at agreements, I think Article 101 should be the first thing that we can immediately look at and address, because this kind of, if you look at the 4 conditions, or as some people call it, the 5 conditions, it gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of looking at how agreements are seen at the moment. This is one area. And second, I would say merger control. Yes, there has been some tightening of practices there. For example, one of the farmer mergers was also brought up, the Illumina merger. This again, for example, if you look at the 6-4 mergers which happened in the bio-seed agri sector, one of the things which I think was relatively under-addressed, even though the Commission goes on to mention in the decisions, is the issue of data captures, which happens in these vertically integrated so-called big data mergers for agriculture. So these are the 2 things which I believe should be key focus when we look at the sector in particular.
Thank you very much for that. I think we're going to be coming back to that topic in the course of the day. I just wanted to hear your opinion so we can comment on it. Professor Strouk, be fast, coherent.
All right, I promise I'll be fast. Professor, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, right? I would like to just ask you a quick question regarding the 3rd bullet point in your summary slide, right? So here, because being an econometrician myself, right, I particularly like your threats to pick up from environmental economics, that especially we should not hesitate in picking up econometric tools available, right? 2 years ago, actually, I supervised one of my master's students. He graduated from the topic of the dynamic multiplier analysis of the Green New Deal, and he found very large fiscal multipliers associated with the Green New Deal, right? So in my view, what do you think that in the area of green competition law, where do you think the main obstacles are to the adoption of these tools that led not only in economics, but to the social science, to what many empiricists refer to as the credibility revolution, right? So where do you think the main obstacles are in the field of competition law, or specifically green competition law? And again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you for the question. That's a very good one and spot on. I think when, for example, when we look at environmental economics, the tools are very well developed there. That's one of the areas that we can, for example, potentially look at. And the issue which comes in traditional competition policy, if I look at competition law and economics, what happens is we have this trend towards quantification. We simply look at, for example, what is the effect of merger in some quantitative terms, the price, competition. Now, the soft elements, for example, if I look at, let's say if somebody is trying to introduce some green products, Kip van Morgan, for example, is one of the classic cases wherein the Dutch Competition Authority also did a lot of ex post analysis therein. One of the things that happened there was the Dutch Competition Authority had a case where some agreement was entered into to produce more sustainable chicken and bring it on the market. And then obviously the authority did some analysis, and then it was like the benefits of this chicken kind of far outweigh in terms of the cost that would be paid by those who are more vulnerable. The issue that comes then in competition policy is this problem or this issue of quantification. And one of the ways that I feel that could be perhaps well addressed by is a little bit of return to the old school. For example, if you look at sub-markets within the main market, because there are local niches, the market, for example, organic products, and again, what is meant by sustainability needs to be defined. If I look at across the spectrum of cases, if I look at Kip and Morgan, the idea was giving a certain kind of chicken. If you look at the mergers, then the issue is slightly different. If I look at the electricity cases, the issue is different. So what is that common definition, that common thread? And second, if I could look at distinct sub-markets which are perhaps able to pay the higher price and sustain it. And secondly, remedies could be a way therein. How could I remedially ensure that other alternatives still remain available in the market? So I think these could be two good ways to go looking at competition policy and sustainability debate in that respect.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Perfect. Thank you once again, Professor. If there are no further questions, then we're going to let Professor go and we're going to continue with the process. So the second presentation today, I'm very glad that we're leaning slightly away from academia into practice. So we're going to have two practitioners, two lawyers in the field of competition law, Skufca and Tjaša, who are going to present their points of view and experience from the practice. So if you're ready, Eva and Tjaša, you might as well give it a go. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. Good morning. Do we hear each other?
Yes, we
okay, do. Perfect. Then I will start sharing my screen. Let me also please know if this works. Just a second. Apologies, everyone. The Zoom application doesn't want to cooperate right now.
No worries, you're not in a rush.
Lila, but it simply, it does not want to, it does not. Tjaša, do you maybe want to share the presentation instead of me? Because at my end, it clearly doesn't want to jump to share screen.
Yes, just a second.
Leila, I will start thinking that practitioners only have a limited access to your platform and not a fully fledged access like the professors had, which might make sense.
No. Not yet. We're not there yet. You have a full access. Let's see. If it doesn't work, I think I received also your slides. I will try to help. Let's just see if Tjaša figures it out. Otherwise, I will jump in. I'm already working on it. No worries.
It's any consolation, Eva. I couldn't get the access until I was given it by Leila. No discrimination.
Thank you,
there.
Simon.
Okay, now Leila is the bad guy who's giving late access. Everybody has access. It's fine. It's just a glitch. We're gonna fix it.
Yeah, I also have difficulties. So Leila, if you could share a screen, that would be appreciated.
How's that?
Fantastic. It works. Thank you very much, Leila.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so good morning, or no longer a morning. Hello to everyone from Tjaša and myself as well. Leila, thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting and topical conference. Also, thank you very much to both of the professors for their presentations already. I have to say, at least for you, Simon, I think your work is really groundbreaking in this field, and it made us all more, I would say, aware of the issues and interested in the issues. So thank you very much. I would say to encourage us all to do something more about it in practice or on the academia level, because I absolutely agree with you. We have no time to waste here. And I think we really need to join forces to do something about it and to address these issues on a more regular basis. In the very beginning, Tjaša and I would actually like to pose a question to everyone, which is competition actually killing us? This is a question which comes from a book that I recently read. I will not reveal my answer till the end, but if somebody wants to see not so much of an academic approach to it, but also kind of a wider picture of a previous practitioner in the field, do check it out. It is very interesting. Tjaša and I will focus today not so much, I would say, on the academics of it, but I would very much like to present the practice and the practical approaches, or how we see this topic ourselves from a practitioner's perspective. Leila, are you moving this, or can I move this now to slide number 2 and 3? Ah, yeah, fantastic. And the next one as well. Lovely, thank you. And as Simon already said, we would first like to touch upon the fact that sustainability and competition, this is not a novel duo, this is not a novel concept. This is something that has been addressed by the European Commission in the early 2000 or in the late 20th century already, and we see good examples from there. We would like to discuss briefly what actually went wrong and what was the impact of the modernization and decentralization introduced with Regulation 1/2003. We will briefly also present the work that has been done by the national competition authorities lately, and the question, of course, is, are they actually taking a step forward or maybe even a step ahead of the European Commission, which we absolutely applaud to. And last but not least, what in our view should and can be done now based on the existing legislative framework, based on the decisional practice that we have, based on the practice of the Court of the Justice of the European Union. Because again, we very much agree with Simon, the framework is there, but we should not be afraid to take the challenge. And we definitely should not, again, this is a practitioner's view, simply shift the entire burden of taking a chance to the companies, because also we see it from practice that they are afraid of how they can be sanctioned with competition law, and they're actually craving for more guidance of the national competition authorities, and especially, of course, of the European Commission. So even though the meme is supposed to be funny, how sustainability is everywhere in 2020, this is actually how it should be. Sustainability should be there everywhere because we have absolutely no time to waste. If we can move to the next slide. We will not go into the treaties, but as Simon already presented, sustainability, environmental concerns lie at the very heart of the EU treaties. So we don't need an additional legal basis, at least not in our view there. Of course, the main question is, should sustainability agreements be caught with EU national competition laws or in general, or should there be, of course, an exemption, and how should it apply? And this is how we should address the questions. There are a couple of legal frameworks available, as Simon presented them, and Martin will go into more detail. We would like to first look at the EC decisional practice from the late 20th century, just to give you a flair of what the legal framework was back then, still is, and how it was used, and maybe give some of the audience who are not lawyers an idea of how these issues have been dealt with 20 years ago already. So the first decision that we have in our presentation, it is the so-called CECED decision. Lila, if you can move forward with the presentation, which is, I would say, a rather straightforward one and a very interesting one. So the CECED was a trade organization of the manufacturers of domestic appliances and national trade organizations. And they asked the European Commission for a negative clearance exemption for their agreement amongst its members and the CECD. The main target here was to switch to eco-friendly and energy-efficient washing machines, so pretty straightforward. And what was really interesting is that the majority of their members were very much up for it. So the affected market was approximately 90% of the EE market for domestic washing machines, with some parties joining later, even up to 95. So it was really a wide market consensus that this is a good initiative which will bring about great, I would say, sustainability effects on the market. So what was the commitment of the companies in question? First of all, and most importantly, they agreed to cease producing and or importing into the community machines belonging to categories E, F, G, that was until the year of 98, and D from the year 2000, which was a very hard commitment. So this was not a voluntary commitment. This was a straightforward commitment by 90% of the market that these machines should no longer be on the market. As you know, we categorize the electronic machines, including washing machines, in the categories from A to G. So the only ones left from 2000 and on should be then A, B, and C. They also committed to improve the availability of information on environmental conscious use of washing machines. So if the first restriction was very much an output restriction, here we're talking about a marketing commitment, which is of course always also beneficial. And furthermore, it was not some sort of a closed group. The agreement as such was open to new participants and remained valid until the end of December of 2001. So when the Commission received the application, they of course looked whether this agreement as such is restricting competition between the parties. And they said, yes, look, there is a clear restriction in the output. So as well as it's very clear that this agreement will be distorting price competition as well, and will have the effect of reducing electricity demand. I was quite, for example, surprised to learn that 2% of total energy consumption in the community was actually the consumption of electricity of washing machines, which I believe is a very considerable number. And just to give you an idea of how big the output restriction is or was in this case, 10% of the washing machines in the community in the year of 97 actually belonged to categories D and G. So the agreement as such was really affecting a high percentage of the market. However, of course, the agreement was designed to reduce the potential energy consumptions of new washing machines by at least 15 to 20%. And the analysis of the European Commission and the CECD actually showed that what the companies achieved with this agreement would otherwise be achieved only in 4 to 8 years. So basically, we saw a huge jump forward in terms of sustainability development because of this agreement. On the next slide, you will see how the European Commission then, I would say, assessed the agreement. as said, the agreement as such was clearly within the Article 101, so the cartel prohibition, but the Commission sought to apply the exemption available in Article 101.3, or at the time 81.3, and in the end really concluded that this is an acceptable article and that actually the positive benefits of the agreement outweigh the restrictive effects on the market. So how did they do that? Basically, within this first point, I will not go into the legal details, but maybe just to give you a bit of a flair, they checked the individual economic benefits, and here they actually realized that individual consumers will be better off because of the agreement in basically 9 to 40 months, meaning that even though they would before buy a, for example, a category G washing machine for a lower price, because they were forced to buy a washing machine of category C, they will actually recoup their investment within 9 to 40 months, depending mainly, of course, on the frequency on use and electricity of prices. But there was a direct, I would say, economic benefit to an individual because this agreement was put in force. Of course, also collective environmental benefits were checked by the European Commission. And there were estimates there that the pollution avoided on a yearly level was simply huge. We're talking about 3.5 million tons of carbon dioxide, just for example, and other, I would say, collective environmental benefits, which were put forward. And here in paragraph 56, this is the quote that you have on the slides. The Commission very clearly actually said that these environmental results for society would adequately allow consumers a fair share of the benefits, even if no benefits accrued to individual purchasers of machines, which for me was a very crucial sentence, because they said, okay, not that only individuals will be better off and will be able to recoup the investment because they will pay for less electricity. The agreement is of such nature that even this common, I would say, environmental benefits will we will all benefit from that. And I think this is the approach that we also need to take forward and from this interesting case. The Commission, of course, also checked whether the restrictions in place were truly indispensable. And they checked this against 3 alternative scenarios. So they would say, okay, would it be actually better if there would be only an industry-wide target, or if the companies would improve their information campaigns, or if this would be kind of sought to solve with an eco-label? And the answer was a clear no, because they said, might be, yes, potentially, that this, I would say, alternative routes would get us to the same result, but absolutely not this fast and to this extent. And this is why we think that the restrictions in place are truly indispensable to reach the goal that we are aiming at. And last but not least, they checked if, I would say, there was an elimination of competition, which would need to be of concern here. And they said, yes, look, clearly the undertakings, the companies will be precluded from putting on the market certain types of washing machines, but A to C remain available. Even more so, we expect that there will be more competition within classes A to C as a result of this agreement. And there is absolutely no restriction as to other market parameters. So there is no coordination with respect to prices or the technology used or how to market these agreements, washing machines, apologies. So there's plenty room to compete. So the room that we take away, meaning from D to G, is actually of smaller nature and should not, because of it, preclude the agreement into coming alive, which I think is also a fantastic conclusion, because this is all true. And I think that society as a whole, as they say, benefits from this agreement significantly. So I see this a very positive example of more than 20 plus years ago of how these issues can be tackled. On the next slide, we have another agreement, and then we will end with the European Commission, but just again to give you a flavor of what happened. So this is the Eacm Agreement from 1998. So here we're talking about the European Association of Consumer Electronics Manufacturers. And they asked the European Commission for a negative clearance exemption for its members to agree to a voluntary commitment. Here, the main target was to reduce the power use of TVs and VCRs in standby mode. So what was the problem? At the time being, the TVs and the VCRs in standby mode was really, really high, and they wanted to actually implement a technical solution or a change in design, more appropriately said, which would decrease this phantom power use, which most of the consumers were not even aware about. So 16 out of 29 members entered into this voluntary commitment. And again, a high share of the EA market was affected. We were talking about the 64%. However, the expected savings annually and in total very much outweighed the costs of implementing this solution. So what was again the sustainability commitment in question? So this excess power use could be reduced by changes in design, and this is what the companies have committed to. Contrary to the agreement that we presented before, this was a pure voluntary commitment. Again, there was, I would say, a marketing commitment reinforcing the basic commitment in place, which is that consumers need to be informed of the standby power use of all the models on the market. And each manufacturer also undertook to participate in further efforts to reduce the energy use of consumer electronic appliances. Here, again, the exemption was applied and the agreement was cleared by the European Commission. As to further, I would say, argue how important it is that in these initiatives, companies get support from, I would say, the public sector, is that the commitment was actually devised by the trade organization in consultation with DG Energy, which again, I think is a fantastic example of how public and private partnership can bring about really great results when there is willingness on both sides. The scheme was administrated by an outside consultant in order to prevent any illicit information exchange. It was open to all manufacturers, so anyone was able to make the commitment and join the scheme. And the only sanction for failing to meet the commitments was actually the publicity that one no longer does so. So much more, I would say, lenient than the first one, but still a great example of how things can be dealt with and pushed forward if there is, I would say, willingness on the side of the industry with the support of the competition authorities, and in this case, in particular, the public sector in charge in general. Lila, if you can push for the next slide. There is one more actually interesting case from that era, which is actually an implementation agreement of the community strategy to reduce CO2 emissions from cars. I would say the mechanics of it was a bit different, but again, a nice example of how public and private working together can bring about great results. So what went wrong, simply? The lawyers on this call very much know that individual exemptions are no longer available. Own assessment is required. And based on the 2004 guidelines on the application of Article 81.3, we should be only thinking about objective economic efficiencies, which very much narrows down the possibility of how to actually grant exemptions and how the companies see their own behavior and cooperation. Furthermore, the new horizontal guidelines, as Simon mentioned already, introduced in 2011, no longer contain a section on environmental agreements. However, I very much also agree that this should not prevent us from using the exemptions that we have, or the guidelines on the applicability of Article 101 from 2011, which nonetheless tackle these issues. But in my view, this nonetheless was a signal to the market that maybe these agreements will no longer be looked at so favorably. And the market, from my experience, actually very much needs such an impulse and needs such an encouragement. On the next slide, we are looking at what the national competition authorities have been doing lately. We have three, which I think are really very much leading this race, is the Dutch, German, and the Greek competition authority. All of them produced really interesting papers and guidelines of how sustainability agreements should be dealt with. The Hellenic Competition Commission actually has a public consultation out there, which is open until the 15th of September. So anyone who is willing to contribute, there is still a chance to do that. But in line with our presentation, we would now just focus on two cases from the Dutch Authority for Consumers and Markets, which also into detail, I would say, checked two interesting sustainability agreements, just to see how these were dealt with and which considerations were taken into account. And Lila, I would ask you if you can give us the next slide, and Tjaša will actually present both of the cases.
Thanks, Eva. Yes, as announced, I will touch base on those two examples from the decisional practice of the Dutch regulator, the Eacm, in which the Eacm acknowledged the broader concept of the benefits of the agreements. And I think these cases can pave the way for the non-economic benefits being factored in future consumer welfare analysis. So the first agreement, or the first case, concerned the energy agreement concluded between 40 parties, including employers, trade unions, and environmental organizations. And part of this agreement included a plan which was aimed at speeding up the closure of 5 coal-fired plants in the Netherlands, the ultimate goal of which was to switch to energy from renewable sources, which was seen as a major step towards a fully sustainable energy supply. Now, when the Eacm was faced with this agreement and assessed its compatibility with the competition law framework, it concluded that the coordinated closure by competitors would basically mean an output restriction, and would thus fall within the cartel prohibition under Article 1011 TFEU, because the Eacm concluded that such agreement would basically lead to a withdrawal of energy production capacity from the market, and as such, constitute an output restriction. On the positive note, as mentioned at the beginning, the Eacm did acknowledge the broader context of this plan, and therefore also checked whether it can apply the exemption criteria under 1013 TFEU. What Eacm did is basically that in cost-benefit analysis, it monetized the environmental benefits of that this agreement would likely bring about, and then weigh those benefits against the expected price increase in electricity. And since it concluded that the price increase would outweigh the benefits, the plan was unfortunately carved out of this agreement. So basically, the Eacm stuck to this economical approach of handling or assessing the consumer benefits. And Leila, please, if we can move to the next slide. The second case concerned the notorious chicken of tomorrow, which was already mentioned by Professor Tyagi. And this agreement was concluded between Dutch supermarkets, the poultry processing industry, and chicken farmers who wanted to switch to a sustainable chicken that would be grown under a set of minimum standards aimed at increasing poultry welfare by, for example, reducing the use of antibiotics, ensuring that the chickens have enough space, that they move more, and of course also additional environmental measures were envisaged. The agreement concerned the buying conditions of the Dutch supermarkets, which would need to be complied with. And this essentially meant that the Dutch supermarkets would only be able to buy and sell meat that meets those sustainable features. Again, when the Eacm was assessing this sustainability agreement, it concluded that the effects of such arrangements restrict competition and violate the prohibition of cartels. And it concluded that as a result of these arrangements, that consumers would no longer be able to buy the so-called regularly produced chicken meat, which would affect the consumer's freedom of choice. So we are here again dealing with an output restriction, and similar to the previous case mentioned, the energy agreement. Here again, the Eacm acknowledged the other benefits, since the agreement, since this initiative Chicken of Tomorrow named several improvements to the production process, such as already mentioned, increased animal welfare, positive effects to the public health, to the environment. So the Eacm, noting all of these benefits, did carry out the analysis under 101(3) and checked whether these benefits can compensate for the drawbacks of the restriction to competition. When assessing the agreement under 101(3) TFEU, the Eacm conducted a so-called willingness to pay study to evaluate what value consumers actually attach to these non-economic benefits, which generally don't have a price tag on the market. And in such studies, the value that consumers attach to those benefits is then converted into a willingness, to a certain degree of willingness to pay of consumers for such measures. And here again, the study showed that additional costs for growing a sustainable chicken exceed the benefits with regards to the animal welfare. And basically this negative consumer surplus, this negative effect on the consumer surplus was then at the end a key motivator for the Eacm not to give the green light to this initiative. What is, in my opinion, maybe worthwhile mentioning at the end is that in their analysis, or when conducting this willingness to pay study, the Eacm relied on the existing paradigms which conceive of consumers' preferences as static factors. What is, in my opinion, worth considering is whether future changes in consumer preferences or preferences of future consumers should as well be taken into account in such analyses, because if we could, for example, predict the preferences of future consumers, or predict how the preferences of now of consumers today will change over time, then I think it is fair to say that the outcome or result of this willingness to pay study could lead to different conclusions. And now this brings us to question what should or can be done now.
Tjaša, we're over the time. If we can speak, because we're also over the time for the quick Q&A. Sorry.
Yeah, we will just sum it up, Leila. We agree that we don't want to put you in a tough spot, but so the way forward as we see it, and based from the view from the practice, which is that companies not only wish but need to see positive examples and having a counterparty who is willing to discuss, we really think that there should be more open, informal communication with the European Commission, with the national competition authorities, because yes, we have some which are active, but we have a vast majority of those who are not willing to discuss at all these topics, and this is not encouraging the industry. We also believe, as Simon also pointed out, there needs to be more decisional practice, and there needs to be use of the informal, I would say either formal decisions as is inapplicability decisions, guidance letter, comfort letters, which we saw in COVID times, that it is possible, so without a legislative change. And yes, it would be great to have guidelines. It would be great to have a formal assessment routes available. But if this is too difficult for the competition authorities to do now, then let's wait for this when we get some practice on board, and let's start discussing the issues now, because there's absolutely no time to waste. The last slide is more meant as a joke or not, because this is what we competition lawyers sees, that this exemption under Article 101(3) is available but not really available. And we just want to stress that in terms of sustainability agreements, this should really not be a joke. Yes, there should be no greenwashing, but we should all realize that there is more to efficiencies than economic efficiencies. And we should consider, as Tjaša mentioned, the consumers of tomorrow and what kind of a world we are living to them. So yes, an appeal from our side is let's get the debate moving among the private practitioners, with academia, and especially with the competition authorities who need to play a more active role. Thanks a lot. Lila, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tjaša, for this, Eva, for the speed up, and Tjaša for the presentation. Just to not go too much in the next participant's time, I've seen Professor Holmes having his hand raised, and I will also check the chat. So please, Professor Holmes, you can go ahead and pose a question, and I'll recheck the chat if we have another question.
Yes, just picking up on one thing that Eva said, she referred to the CZ washing machine case. That's just the sort of case that I referred to when I said there's nothing much new in what we're talking about now. That illustrates that this line of thinking was perfectly normal if you go back 20 years. And one particular point from that was the Commission cleared the agreement, although they had agreed to cease producing the environmentally unfriendly washing machine. That reminds you of the sort of examples I've had about where you agree to source on a sustainable basis fishing, but you can agree not to source on an unsustainable basis. None of us have a right to artificially treat products that are subsidized by society, as the true costs have been dumped on society. If it costs 1 cent more to have something on a sustainable basis, well, too bad. That's the judgment element that I was talking about. Now, exceptionally, you can see that there could be hardship for some of the poorer people. Well, that's going to be very much the exception, and I don't want the tail wagging the dog. So if, for example, producing something on using renewable energy is more expensive than using dirty fossil fuels, which interestingly is not likely to be the case going forward as renewable energy prices fall. But if that were the case, and that was resulted in what we call energy poverty, then the way to deal with that is through other social measures, support for energy bills and so forth. It is not to allow people to go on having a right to somehow having dirty energy, whatever the cost for society and the climate. Sorry, it's really a comment.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have another question? If not right now, you can still pose it later. I suggest that we give the time slot that pertains to Dr. Gassler as the next participant to present his work, and then maybe we can sum it up with additional questions of the two participants, actually, because the first Professor Kaplani had to go. So I would suggest to continue with Professor Gassler, if you're ready. And yes, his presentation is also going to focus on Article 101. So
Thank you very much. I also try to share my screen with you.
So far, so good. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. So, as mentioned, I will also focus about on Article 101. There are the areas 102, state aid, merger control, which have been discussed. But I think from a practitioner's point of view, I think Article 101 is hotly debated right now, and I think that's the most relevant. And also, as Professor Tyagi has said, that should be the key focus of the sustainability discussion. And that's also the reason why I want to talk about that. And I want to structure my presentation in kind of two parts. So the first is just to give you an overview of the current debate. I think Simon, Eva, and Professor Tyagi has already kind of gave you an excellent overview, but I just want to kind of put a different perspective on matters, maybe more from a practitioner's point of view. And then also I want to give you a quick outlook of where I think the discussion could go, and the horizontal cooperation guidelines and rules are currently under evaluation, so it's highly relevant at the moment. So I hope you can see my next slide. Excellent. So let's start with the first part, and I think the perfect starting point is actually the Commission and kind of the perspective of the Commission. And as already mentioned by Simon, I think everything started with the Green Deal announcement in 2019. That was kind of the starting point for the sustainability debate in competition law. Simon was one of those who was active very early, and I think it really took off last year, 2020, maybe due to COVID and people actually had time during the lockdown. But I think really last year, a lot of practitioners got into the ring and got interested in the sustainability debate. And back then, and it's still largely the case, competition law is still perceived as an obstacle in practice. And so Commissioner Vestager just searched for different speeches, what she actually had to say about sustainability. And as you can see, it's not as ambitious as probably Simon is. I think it's a more humble approach, particularly if you read, for instance, the second quote: competition law is not and cannot be in the lead when it comes to making Europe green. And I think that was mentioned in 2020. The third one is essentially the same. It's not the main tool, but I think it's fair to say that it's one of the tools to help facilitate achieving the green goals. And it's not just about climate change, it's about other sustainability goals as well. And you can see the last quote, it's really, I think, for practitioners, really looking out for that. So at the moment, you see in my next slide, it's in the evaluation phase, but probably by the end of next year, we'll actually find a document by the Commission presenting its view on the topic. And that's just giving, like in the vertical context, options where they think they could go. I think by next year, we'll actually see the first draft of the updated horizontal guidelines and how they actually want to change the rules. You can see on that slide, and that's also the reason, and part of the reason why practitioners are particularly interested in the topic, because they are currently the horizontal cooperation guidelines and rules. So these are the two block exemptions, and you could not just amend the guidelines, but also the rules. And as you can see, currently they are in public consultation. The adoption is planned for end of next year. And the Commission has already kind of put out some documents, and I think particularly the second one in May this year. You can find the number here. Essentially gives a glimpse of what the Commission kind of got from the public. And as Simon mentioned, you can see that in the first quote, obviously it's not just sustainability, I think it's also digitalization, and you can see that. But as Simon mentioned, I think sustainability is probably the more hotly debated right now. And it also got the feedback from national competition authorities that there is more guidance needed. And it's also interesting to see where it could go. So it was mentioned kind of the standardization chapter, and I'll also mention that maybe later. So even if they don't kind of decide to go for a different chapter, I think the ideas behind the standardization chapter and the safe haven which is there could be an inspiration for sustainability agreements as well. And as you can see, the conclusion is pretty much clear. I think it's fair to say to expect guidance in the horizontal cooperation guidelines, possibly also the exemption guidelines. So that's the perspective of the Commission. The national authorities are also interesting in the debate. I just want to mention three already mentioned by Eva, so I will not discuss the cases anymore. So the chicken of tomorrow case from the Dutch competition authority is obviously very influential. Also very helpful that a quite good case summary was published, so you could actually understand the case and its context. And I think the key of that for the academic debate is really kind of, is that willingness to base study really the right tool to actually deal with sustainability agreements? And it was heavily criticized how it was conducted. So I don't think that's without any criticism. And you can see now that the Dutch authority is actually going in a different direction. If you kind of go through the press releases, they are now trying to focus more on what Simon described as a kind of competition or compete on sustainability, to kind of to try to give companies guidance on how to make sustainable offers and how to actually present them. That's a little bit in overlap with consumer law, but I think that's a very interesting area also for competition law, because it kind of shifts the discussion. So at the beginning, you maybe need the rules more relaxed, but once kind of sustainability is part of a competitive factor, I think you can have the beauty of competition and compete for sustainable offers, but that may not work for all areas. And obviously, it was already mentioned, the draft guidelines. I think that was very influential back then, and it's also very practical. It's guidelines like the Commission's guidelines. And then also already mentioned the Hellenic Competition Authority. I've also seen today their kind of that proposal with the sandbox, where you can experiment private initiatives on sustainability under the supervision of the Hellenic Competition Authority. Very interesting. They also have an excellent paper on sustainability and competition law. It's more academic, a lot of footnotes, you find everything there. Very interesting though, and that just a few words on that, the German Federal Cartel Office, the Bundeskartellamt, they also published a working document. And I think here you can see an example of a competition authority that is more cautious in the debate. So the Hellenic Competition Authority, more so than the Dutch, is very open to kind of interpret competition law more greener. And I think the German, at least in a document, that's a more cautious approach. And they're trying to argue, well, it's not so much a competition authority that is well suited for weighing public interests against competition law interests, but it's more the legislator, and it's pointing towards regulation as the right tool. And that's, I think, in line with Commissioner Vestager, what she said. It's not the main tool in the debate, but it's a useful tool. And also interesting, particularly for Professor Spruck, if I remember that correct, they also have a brief discussion here about market failures, and they argue, well, that's actually the key source why you need that agreement, and that's the problem. It's market failures, is not the strict interpretation of competition law. So that's a more cautious approach in the among the competition authorities. Also, kind of the academic side, very brief. I don't think it's black and white as kind of on that slide, but I do think not everyone is on the same page as, for instance, Simon is. I think there are also a lot of academics and papers you find that they're very, very cautious. Just mentioned two of those. They are it's about greenwashing, exaggerated sustainability claims, also about too many goals, trying to implement in the analysis, making it too complex. But I think most are actually on the side that there needs to be a change, if not in the rules, just in the interpretation. And I think most of the papers I read in the area just interpret the rules differently, more greener, which was already a case 20 years ago, essentially. Okay, so that was kind of just to give you an overview of the different perspectives. And I now want to talk about kind of my perspective, kind of also Eva's perspective, kind of practitioner's perspective, when clients come to you with kind of private sustainability agreements and you want to get your advice, is it possible or not? And at the moment, the framework you see right now, I think that's essentially, and it's already kind of touched by Simon, I think that's essentially the framework, although I think the main routes are really route 3 and 4. 1 and 2, I think, are still academic, particularly the first one, but the second one has a lot of potential. So what are these routes all about? So the first one is, you can argue, well, the agreement is outside the scope of 101, and there are 2 kind of strands here. You can say, well, it's mandated by the state. Sometimes you try to argue that when you, for instance, when there is a directive and you have to follow that, it was, I mentioned in the slide, you can find a case where it was tried, but they ultimately failed. Duales System Germany, kind of the packaging directive. They tried that, but it failed. So I think it's very difficult in practice to argue that. And then the other strand is a complete sectorial exception for certain types of sustainability agreements. And that is by using the Albany case, which is in the context of collective bargaining. Again, I think it's very difficult. Maybe at some point there will be a case in the sustainability context where that judgment will be tried, but I think very different to kind of just completely exempt sustainability agreements, because the kind of range of initiatives is simply so wide. So a little bit skeptical about that route. The second one, I think, had a lot of potential. So the second one is about the idea that if you have an agreement, 101 does not apply if that agreement is kind of necessary for a legitimate non-economic goal. So kind of the competition restrictions are an afterthought, but you can't tweak the agreement without these kind of competition restrictions. And so 101 does not apply here. You find the cases, Wouters and also McMedina, in different contexts. So it was normally in an association context. So both cases actually, there were other Italian cases here, but these are the most famous ones. Still not tested in courts in a sustainability context. I think the appeal of that route is, well, first of all, it's not as radical as the first one. You still have a proportionality test, so you still have to try to what is necessary. Is it really necessary, the agreement for achieving the non-economic goal? And then compared to the fourth route, which is kind of the individual exemption under 101 paragraph 3, it's much simpler. It's just essentially proportionality test known from the case law from free movement of goods, for instance, very similar to those. And I see the fourth route is really difficult to, at the moment, to apply in practice because much is unclear. So brings me to the third route. So you can also try to argue that there is no restriction of competition. And Simon has already mentioned that in the old horizontal cooperation guidelines, there was a dedicated chapter. Eva also mentioned that essentially 3 scenarios. And interestingly, in the new horizontal cooperation guidelines, Simon mentioned that they're not there anymore. And I found in the contribution by the Commission to the OECD by the Commission that actually the justification for that was more that they didn't find it suitable anymore to have a dedicated chapter, but instead they thought the other chapters were sufficient enough. And I don't think that they actually were trying to say, well, we are more skeptical about environmental agreements. I just thought, that's my understanding, I just think they didn't consider that we are in 2020 talking about sustainability in that hotly. And as you can see, these 3 scenarios were we kind of set out very early, and you can find them interestingly in the Dutch draft guidelines. Again, very similar language, but essentially these 3 scenarios. But you find a fourth scenario, and that's very interesting. It's about code of conducts when they talk about promoting environmentally friendly conduct. And they say if certain conditions are fulfilled, and I think they're very similar to kind of the safe haven in the standardization chapter and already in the horizontal cooperation guidelines. If they are fulfilled, it's fine. There's no restriction of competition. And they are, so these conditions are the participation criteria need to be transparent, non-discriminatory, and as a company, alternative standards must be possible on the markets. You can't say, well, it's just that one standard, one code of conduct. And also individual parties, they must be able to sell also outside of that code. I think the idea is very similar to the standardization agreement, and that could be also picked up. Maybe in the Commission's document I mentioned before, maybe kind of the standardization agreement thought was already kind of coming from the Dutch Competition Authority, just an idea. But as you can see, it's already there, 3 scenarios. As a practitioners, I think that's very useful when you kind of advise clients to have something you can actually cite. And that brings me to the last route, individual exemption under 101 paragraph 3. I think that's just the most obvious and the most mainstream route you can go for. Most cases you heard today, Jacob tomorrow, Energy Court, the washing machine case from Commission, they all kind of going for that route. The problem at the moment is, I'm just trying to kind of summarize the current debate here. The problem is essentially with 2 conditions here. So I didn't mention all 4 conditions. I think 2 are the problem. And I absolutely agree with Simon that most of the discussion here is all about, it seems very academic and no one actually looks at kind of constitutional provisions, what the law actually says, actually looking into Article 101, paragraph 3, but it's just developed over time. And I just want to give you the context kind of Eva was already mentioning. The first issue is about non-economic benefits. So can they be taken into account in the analysis? And I think it's not that clear when you read, when you see at the moment kind of the Commission guidelines. And the interesting aspect here, it was pretty much clear when the Commission had a monopoly over Article 101, paragraph 3, and they granted a lot of individual exemptions. The C case, the washing machine case is a good example. You saw it in the horizontal cooperation guidelines, in the old ones. And as Eva mentioned, something changed then. When Regulation 1/2003 came into force, the Commission lost its monopoly. And the fear was that national competition authorities, new were created, for instance, in Austria, others were already there, but the fear was these competition authorities, almost national courts, can now apply 101 paragraph 3, and we don't trust them as much as our own judgment. So we put out these documents, these guidelines, actually arguing for a more narrow understanding. And if you read the exemption guidelines, it's essentially all about economic benefits. And already back then, you can find literature saying, well, it's actually in stark contrast to what you actually Commission did yourself. And Eva mentioned those cases. They were all kind of in the centralized enforcement area. And also empirical research, just want to mention, I find a very good article by Brooke showing, actually looking at national competition authorities, and she's finding that actually the exemption guidelines actually created massive differences in the EU. Some followed the narrow understanding of the exemption guidelines, some did not. So it was actually discrepancy created. And one of the authorities that did already consider non-economic benefit were Dutch authority. And I just want to kind of touch on one area which I find very interesting, also as a practitioner, because for us, the economic analysis is always, I understand that's a useful tool, and in practice, the problem is also very, very, very costly. It's time consuming, and a lot of clients just want simple advice. And I think if you really want to push the sustainability debate forward and make it a policy priority, you have to think about when do you not quantify non-economic benefits. And you can see ideas in the draft guidelines from Dutch authority, and they put out just right before again what they call qualitative assessment. You only have to describe the benefits, and they say that's enough when you fulfill two conditions. Well, first of all, market share is below 30%, and the benefits are obviously larger than the harm to consumers. You can debate about what's obviously larger than maybe you can consult with the authority about that, but I think the idea is excellent. I've read though arguments saying, well, it's actually backwards, the economization of competition about a lot of predictability. That's certainly true. I don't think it's all about not quantifying, not trying to quantify non-economic benefit, but you have to kind of provide companies with a safe haven where you don't have to go into that costly time-consuming analysis of actually trying to quantify something which is very difficult, and that's kind of the second point. If you decide to actually quantify them, I don't think that's very easy. And as Simon mentioned, at the end of the day, it's probably a judgment call: which analysis, which tool you apply, what are the drawbacks, how good is the data, and none of this is perfect. And if you want to have a good paper here, it's by Kleissi and Lutz. They just very short article give an overview of the tools available, and I think that's a discussion among economists. But I think as a lawyer and as a policy maker, one should really think about also not quantifying it. And you saw the chicken of tomorrow case, already mentioned before. There was a willingness to pay study, and they simply quantified, well, that the consumers don't value the increase in animal welfare not as much. Well, they actually ask, and you can ask a more fundamental question here: should all the social interests really be reduced to purely monetary interest? Because at the end of the day, what the Dutch authority tried to do is actually give it a price tag. So what is the expected price increase, and also give the animal welfare a number. And they just came out with an analysis where the number for the increase of animal welfare was just lower than the price increase. And you can really question more fundamentally whether it's actually the right approach to deal with these cases. And so that was one area under 101 paragraph 3. And then there's another area, and it's about the scope of beneficiaries. So some argue, well, and you find that approach in the Commission's exemption guidelines. They suggest strongly that only consumers on the relevant market, and only exceptionally on related market, but the key is really on the relevant market. Only these consumers are actually relevant for the analysis, so where the benefits occur. And as you know, environmental agreements are all about different markets. When you have an environmental agreement, it's aimed to reduce actually negative externalities, pollution. It's certainly more than just the relevant market. And you can find, again, the Dutch here, in the draft guidelines, you can find the notion of society as a whole. And also others point out to future generations, which should also be considered. And interestingly, and that was already mentioned because I saw it on the slide before and looked it up again, in the washing machine case, actually the expression of society as a whole was described as benefits to society. So it's nothing novel here. It's just that the Commission with the exemption guidelines really narrowed down everything and kind of reinterpreted competition. Without the rules didn't change, just interpretation by the Commission, and some people followed them. And also, if you look in the case law, just briefly on that, there are two cases I think worth mentioning. CGM, where the court put in the quote, where the court essentially said, well, it's not just the relevant market you have to consider, it's beneficial effects. And reading the last quote here, without requiring a specific link with the relevant market. That's the general quote. I think that's pretty clear what the general quote is thinking about. Certainly not just the relevant market. You find a different case, MasterCard, that's cited normally to kind of go as a step back, because what MasterCard was all about, two-sided market, and essentially the competition harm occurred on one side of the market and the benefit exclusively on the other side of the market. I think what the court had in mind Well, you can't do that. If the market where the harm occurs has no benefits at all, that's not possible. And the way how to kind of bring both cases together is kind of, you need to have at least some benefits, but not all benefits, some benefits for the consumers on the relevant market, but then you could consider these out-of-market benefits beyond the relevant market. That's one way to read the case law here. All right, so that's where we are. And now just want to go in the second part where we could go, policy options. And I put kind of the interpretation of competition law, how to make competition law greener. I think probably the right approach is how to make interpretation of competition law greener, how it was 20 years ago. These cases you saw, nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed was Regulation 1 2003, and that was a procedural change. But on the substantive areas, nothing really has changed. And so one option, very obvious one, of course, is the soft law instruments. And we'll most likely see them in the horizontal cooperation guidelines, as I mentioned, currently under review. I also think the exemption guidelines would also be a good starting point for putting in some clarifications. And then I think one should think about safe haven. If you really want to push sustainability as a policy option, I think you need to give companies safe haven to actually go for them, to actually have a minimal risk of competition or infringement. And then also I think, and that's something for practitioners, you have to kind of explain in what scenarios a pure qualitative assessment is sufficient, maybe in consultation with the authority. Because as I mentioned before, quantitative assessment, I understand is very valuable, but also very expensive, very cost intensive, and a lot of particularly smaller companies, they won't spend as much money on that assessment. So that's the first option, which is probably very likely. The second one, as mentioned by Simon, some are skeptical. I do think one should consider the sustainability block exemption. So what is a block exemption? Block exemption is essentially, it's not a soft law instrument, so it not just binds the Commission, but it also binds national competition authorities and national courts. And the idea behind a sustainability block exemption could be that you actually bring in line all the competition authorities. Because if you just put it in the soft law instruments of the Commission, the fear, as with the exemption guidelines, could be that some follow that approach and some are still skeptical. And if you actually have it written in law, in a block exemption, the risk of divergent interpretation would be much lower. Obviously, I agree completely with Simon. It really depends on a kind of political level, how far you actually want to go. But I think from a practitioner's perspective, I think that would be very helpful actually push sustainability initiatives. And then as a last thought, that's already my last slide here, a third option is about publications. Publication of case reports. I mentioned the Chicken of Tomorrow case, and the Dutch authorities is brilliant in that matter. You can really read the case and understand the context. I think it would be a consideration to kind of collect all these cases, maybe in a centralized database. I know on DG Comp's website there are certain databases. They're not very recent and not perfect, but that could be an option to make it accessible to a wider audience. And then I think for the Commission, as you saw, all the cases were actually before Regulation 1 2003, so in the era of centralized enforcement, and then there are no cases anymore. And one policy option could be to just go for the comfort letters, which were there in the COVID time, and actually try to produce some comfort letters and see the kind of the cases you can deal which are fine, kind of the green light case. And I think that would be very valuable for practitioners, because as practitioners, you also have to consider it's nice to have kind of the academic side of the debate, but if you're advising clients, you can't cite kind of paper by Simon or other academics. It's really these kind of, it's soft law instruments, these case reports, which are really key in how you advise a client. So if the Commission is going in a direction, I think that would be a very valuable contribution. And then kind of my last idea is about EU codes. I think I mentioned it before. I think route number 1 and 2, so the Albany and the Wouters route, I'm a little bit skeptical that that can work, particularly as a practitioner before the authority. I think for this route to work in a sustainability context, you really need the backing of EU codes in a sustainability context. And also the problem obviously being that you actually have to find clients who are willing to challenge a possible more cautious approach of a national competition authority. And maybe one can think about ways in actually getting some cases on that matter before EU courts, because it would be very interesting to see the courts kind of in the one-on-one context give their judgment call or their idea on how to assess these. And could be that the Wouters route is actually then a valuable option. But I think at the moment, it's still more as an exotic route and mostly kind of limited to the kind of debate among academia. And with that, I want to conclude. As mentioned by Simon, I think the rules are already there. The interpretation was already there 20 years ago, and we still have to go back where we actually were 20 years ago. And so that should be an easy fix. And I think the key practical contribution really is software instruments and cases. I think if they are there, practitioner will also jump on the boat on making competition law greener. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. All 3 contributions right now gave us a lot to think about. Are there any comments, questions from the audience? Because we're a little bit, yes, exactly. Simon says back to the future. We're a bit running behind the schedule, and we have a presentation scheduled straight at 12:30. If there are no comments or questions right now, I would like to ask Martin if you're open for people sending you actually comments and questions through your credentials and through your contact.
Yes, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. So I would conclude at this point. Let's take a 20-minute break, because at 12:30 we're convening back again, and we're going to be starting 12:30 sharp. Okay, so 20 minutes for a nice coffee, a bit of a break, and then we're straight back at it. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. A short break.